It's time for some collective wisdom, a podcast advancing the cannabis revolution, one conversation at a time. We all benefit from sharing knowledge and experiences. So if you want to learn about the business of cannabis from those in the trenches, you've come to the right place. Here's your host, Lisa Tollner, co-founder of SensiChew.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today. My guest is Emily Earlenbaugh. She is a PhD, a writer, and an educator, as well as co-founder and director of Education for Mindful Cannabis Consulting. She earned her PhD at UC Davis in the philosophy of science, specializing in analyzing scientific studies, and she put her doctorate to work in both evaluating the scientific research that is available about cannabis and in developing scientifically grounded tools for cannabis users to utilize in their own journey of finding the right cannabis products and options. As someone who both consults and writes regularly for top cannabis publications, Emily eats, sleeps, and breathes cannabis education. And she publishes hundreds of articles on the topic every year for publications like Leafly, Cannabis Now magazine, and San Francisco Chronicle's Green State. Emily is also co-founder and director of Education for Mindful Cannabis Consulting, where she teaches cannabis users how to find the options that work best for them, incorporating both scientific and mindfulness tools in her work. She has a strong background in meditation and mindfulness and has been practicing for almost a decade. She is a graduate of and faculty member with Karuna Training, a 3-year intensive program that teaches compassion and mindfulness-based skills for working with emotions. I've had the pleasure and opportunity to work with Emily on a SensiChew cannabis sleep study where she provided her scientific and research insights and analysis of our 250 participants. Emily Earlenbaugh, it's a pleasure to have you on Collective Wisdom.
Thank you. It's great to be on Collective Wisdom. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, we've had the opportunity to work together last year, and I learned a lot from you, and also having a better understanding of how you assess and analyze cannabis use, and at least the study we were working on. But one of the things that's really become more interesting for me is this merger that you've identified between meditation and healing. And your mindful approach to cannabis use was inspired by your own experiences to treat chronic pain and anxiety conditions. I'd love it if you could share some of your experience and discovery.
So I started getting into this whole world of cannabis as a cannabis patient. I have been diagnosed with fibromyalgia, a chronic pain condition, and generalized anxiety disorder, which leaves me with a lot of symptoms even beyond the anxiety, really intense muscle tension and pain related to that, issues with cognition and mental functioning surrounding anxiety. So this is something that I've been dealing with for my entire life and really escalated when I was a college student in undergrad. So doctors put me on some pharmaceutical medications, recommended some different things, and that helped me for a short period of time. But then midway through being in my PhD program, I had another really bad flare-up as the pharmaceuticals I was taking stopped working well and actually began to cause problems with my immune system. So at that point, I was living in California and I felt like maybe cannabis is something that could help me. So I did some research on it. I started experimenting and I was kind of amazed at what a huge impact it made. So something that I discovered as I was going through this was, wow, there is a tremendous amount of variety in cannabis. There are so many different types of cannabis, so many different ways of using it. And some of those combinations of these different variables were just incredible, life-saving. I went from I was filling out disability forms and I had taken a leave of absence from my PhD program because I was dealing with such intense symptoms. I wasn't able to get out of bed most days, much less engage in heavy research. When I started using cannabis, it totally turned things around for me. without intense anxiety and intense pain that had been really, clouding my entire experience, I was able to really engage with life again, become more functional, get back into my program at school, finish my PhD, all of this with daily cannabis use. But I also found that some types of cannabis would do kind of the opposite. I would try a strain that maybe someone else said helped them relax, and suddenly I would be even more anxious. I would have more pain. I'd be disoriented. I'd have a headache. So I was really trying to figure out, how can I find the products that are going to work for me consistently and avoid having any of these negative side effects? And that's part of where the mindfulness aspect really came in, because there are so many options and there's research that you can do to figure out what's a good bet for your symptoms. But ultimately, as patients, we need to try different things out, see how they work for us, and really be careful and mindful about noticing the impact that it's having on us to really hone in on those solutions.
Sure. Do you find that as you're working with your patients and the folks that you consult with, that you're keeping a journal? You're actually detailing the effects of certain things that they're trying. So you are giving it the mindfulness, but also almost a scientific approach. This didn't work, but this did.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I've found from my personal experience and with patients is that, it seems kind of easy to just remember what worked for you, but often there's not a lot of consistency in supply. So you might find a strain that worked really well for you, but then it's not available anymore. So you'd need to try something else. A lot of people kind of lose track of what's worked for them and what hasn't. And also, people might not always notice subtleties of what's happening for them. So what I did was combined tools that I was learning about in my PhD program about how scientists measure subjective experiences like pain, anxiety. In my research, I was looking at happiness and well-being. And I sort of designed tools using those best practices for patients to use on their own so that they could track in a variety of different ways how they were feeling. For some people, they preferred to use verbal cues, writing things down about their experiences. And for some, I had tools that allow them to numerically rank different aspects of their experience and then be able to look back and say, oh, this strain had my best ranking. This was one that did really well for me. Take a moment to see, how am I feeling before the cannabis use? And then how am I feeling after the cannabis use? I find it helps people to get to their best solution much more quickly.
So it's really taking a moment to stop and reflect on how you're feeling, how you felt before, how you felt after. And often in our busy lives, we don't give it that much time. We tend to sort of rush through it and say, yeah, it kind of worked, kind of didn't, but really stopping to say, yeah, wow, I feel better. Now, you mentioned body scan. Is that one of the practices then, to stop for a moment and kind of mentally scan your body? What is body scan? I sort of jumped to that conclusion.
Yeah, no, you're on target. So this is a tool that comes out of MBSR training, a program designed to help people with things like chronic pain and anxiety using meditative techniques. So in this practice, people literally scan with their attention from one part of the body. So you might start with your feet and then gradually just notice all of the sensations in each part of your body as you're going. And this can be really helpful for patients that are dealing, especially with multiple symptoms, because, you might try some type of cannabis and be like, oh, I like this, but it might be only helping with one of your symptoms. Take the time to notice, okay, I had a headache. Now it's been a half an hour since I've used cannabis. My headache is gone, but this pain in my leg is still here. But you might find with another type of cannabis that it helps your body pains, but it doesn't help your headache. So noticing these subtle details in what a product is actually doing for you can help you to create a little toolkit for yourself of different medicinal options for what you're actually dealing with.
Now, it's interesting, and when I'm thinking about meditation and people who've practiced meditation and believe in it and other sort of mindful practices of kind of slowing down and really looking and paying attention, but yet there's a lot of people that think it's hogwash. What do you say to non-believers?
Well, I would say that there is a fair bit of scientific data suggesting that there are health benefits and emotional benefits from meditation and other mindfulness practices. So, that's usually the first place that I would point them to. And I would also say that meditation isn't for everyone. There are people who don't do well with meditation, in particular, people dealing with intense trauma histories. There's data suggesting meditation could actually cause reliving of the trauma in an unhelpful way. So with anything, I don't believe there's one size fits all solution that will work well for every person in every context. But I think that there's a lot of people who have found dramatic benefits from meditation and mindfulness practices. And for myself, I've definitely experienced that. Part of what's key to these practices is actually practicing becoming tolerant to whatever is happening in the moment. That's kind of a key of meditation, mindfulness practices, is that there's suffering in your life. There's suffering in all of our lives. And we have different abilities to actually be tolerant to the fact that we are suffering. And so that can actually create additional stress and suffering. So, you can talk about something called the window of tolerance. People have different windows of tolerance of what they're able to handle before they have a breakdown or they become overwhelmed. And so there's research suggesting that meditation is something that helps people to open that window of tolerance, allows them to become more resilient to the stressors in their life.
Interesting. Well, and when you think about it, it's logical because we all reach certain points when so much piles up where you do think, wow, is this my breaking point? Have I reached my stage where I can't take one more thing, or I will implode, or I'm really not going to do well if one more thing gets bombarded or influences my life in a way that is stressful? And so being able to have an awareness of that it's there. It's almost an acknowledgement at some point too. So fascinating. I've read a little of your work about IQ and cannabis. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I've found this a really interesting topic in the science and policy of cannabis because, a lot of people will mention that cannabis use in adolescence can cause these drops in IQ later on in life. So this kind of feeds into this idea that cannabis will make you stupid or be bad for your educational experience. And for me, having gone through a PhD program while using cannabis on a daily basis, even using cannabis when I went in to defend my dissertation, I haven't found that it's had a negative impact on my cognitive abilities in that way. So I've always been interested in the research on that. And, there was this pivotal study, it was done in 2012, that showed that while there were no IQ drops associated with using cannabis as an adult, if you started using cannabis before age 16, you would see these modest IQ drops. Studies put them between 2 and 7 IQ points, depending on the study. So this was a pretty consistent result that was coming up. So it seemed pretty clear that cannabis could really be having kind of neurotoxic effects and impacting brain development in adolescence. But what's interesting is that in recent years, scientists have decided to look at this from another angle. And what they did was start these twin studies. So in twin studies, instead of just looking at a population and saying this population correlates with this kind of result, you're actually looking at the difference between the two twins. So for these IQ studies, they looked at pairs of twins where one twin used cannabis before they were 16 and the other twin did not. And so what they would expect to see based on the previous research is that the twin who used cannabis would have a drop in IQ And the twin who didn't use cannabis would not see a drop in IQ because they weren't exposed to the drug. But what they actually found was that there was still an IQ drop, but it was for both twins. So in these twin pairs, twins that didn't use cannabis were experiencing the same IQ drops as their twin who did use cannabis. So what this shows is that it's not actually a chemical response to having cannabis in your system, but there's some other factor that makes it both more likely for you to start using cannabis as an adolescent and also makes it likely for you to have these IQ drops. So one thing that these researchers tied it to was impulsivity, but there's also been research looking at it in terms of health issues, socioeconomic issues, looking at other types of drugs and substances that might be being used. So basically what we're seeing is that there's not a correlation between cannabis and IQ drop at a chemical level. There's some other factor that seems to be causing it.
Fascinating. I can think of some young adults that I've known that had various on the spectrum, ADHD, various learning disabilities, some hyperactivity, some just inability to focus. And cannabis had a remarkable positive impact on their learning. I can think of a few young adults who've actually graduated top of their class and went on to become very successful. It's not for everyone, but certainly needs to be more work done. And there's a case to be made for it not being a problem, for it not creating a chemical problem and drop in IQ, as you were saying.
And, I think there are, also, depending on the legality of cannabis, there are good reasons for teens to hold off on using it if they don't have a medical reason for it.
Right.
But I think that it's a shame when this misinformation about cannabis is causing parents to not allow their teens to use cannabis medicinally when it might be a safer option than the pharmaceuticals that they're getting from the doctor.
Correct. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening in the research side of things. I'm sure everyone's run into challenges with cannabis research today. Do you feel it's getting better, or is it about the same as it was pre-cannabis legalization?
I think we've seen some improvements. We've seen more studies getting approved for looking for positive results from cannabis, as opposed to only approving studies that are looking for some kind of harm, which has been a big issue. But I think there are some outstanding problems, especially in the US, when it comes to researching cannabis that is really tying the hands of our researchers in a way that makes it difficult to get strong data. And one of the biggest problems that we have is the fact that researchers need to source their cannabis if they're going to do this kind of well-regulated study where they're actually administering consistent cannabis to each person in the study. They need to source that cannabis through the government. And the supply of cannabis that the government has to offer is actually incredibly different than the cannabis that is available for consumers on the open market. One of the big differences is the amount of cannabinoids in those products. The government has strains that have been around for a long time, and there's been a lot of changes to cannabis over that time. So we have extremely high THC options now. We have very high CBD options now. And those differences aren't really reflected in what researchers have available. So I've talked to many researchers who are just frustrated because their studies are getting approved, but then they can't get the results that would actually be useful to people because they're essentially testing a different version of the plant than what's available.
Yeah, unfortunate. Just thinking about studies that I was talking to a researcher from UCLA just yesterday and looking at possible studies where the control is not as rigorous as it would be getting the cannabis from the government, where it would be the patient's and the participant's own supply.
Yeah.
But then again, there's where you automatically see differences. The strains are going to be different, potentially what they have, if the participants could at least say, okay, we're going to have this level of THC and we're testing a sativa, an indica, or a hybrid, and at least get it to be family specific, could help. But therein lies yet another problem, with something that has the controls that you needed to have for optimal feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have that sort of two-pronged possibilities. You can, as a researcher, you can either go with the government supply of cannabis, which isn't representative of what patients are really using, and you can do your study in a very well-controlled manner where you know exactly what chemicals the participants are actually ingesting. Or you can let people source their own cannabis and then really have not much idea about what compounds you're even studying. You can study cannabis, but what does that mean? There are over 500 different chemical compounds that can be found in different varieties of cannabis. So they've even done research showing that there are big differences in terms of how someone might be affected by two different strains. So if you're looking at something like anxiety, for example, there could be a big difference in how someone responds in general to a sativa or an indica, even different strains within that. There have been studies from within the industry looking at whether certain products may be more efficacious for anxiety than others. And they found that some are more efficacious according to patient reports. Right. So, it's important that we're able to research what people are actually using and research what are the effects of this particular blend of chemicals, as opposed to just saying cannabis in general, which explains in large part why you often have inconsistent results in different pieces of research from the cannabis space.
Yeah, too many variables. Way too many variables. Emily, what do you think is from your view of the world, what's the most exciting thing that you think is happening in the cannabis space?
That's a hard question for me because I'm so immersed in the cannabis space. There's so much exciting things happening.
Is there any one thing that really bubbles to the surface for you?
I think what's really exciting is just watching the legalization movement unfold and seeing the change in how people respond. So, I've been kicking around the industry for the last 10 years and seen California go through its legalization movement for recreational. And, there's been a lot of challenges in adapting to new regulations and getting the regulations right, but it's really exciting and encouraging to see the cannabis approval numbers keep going up. More and more people are saying, yeah, I understand why someone would use this, not viewing it as something that should be stigmatized and that people should be going to prison for or having their children taken away for. So just seeing that national response and even global response as more and more states and more countries approve medical cannabis, it's been beautiful to see.
It has. I agree. As we all say, the genie is out of the bottle.
Yeah.
And it's moving forward. Emily, how can our listeners learn more about you and the work you're doing?
So if my listeners are interested in finding out about my consulting work, you can find that at mindfulcannabis.com. And if you're interested in following my science writing, you can follow me on Instagram at Emily Earlenbaugh, all one word. And I tend to post a lot of my interesting articles there.
Thank you, Emily. I really enjoyed our conversation and learning more about your work and the education that you're providing.
Thanks again.
Oh, you're welcome. We've been speaking with Emily Earlenbaugh, PhD, writer, and educator. This is your host, Lisa Tollner. Thank you for tuning in to Collective Wisdom, and until next time, be well.
That's this week's episode of the Collective Wisdom Podcast. Join us each week for another episode on OC Talk Radio, streaming on Thursdays at 3 p.m., and you can download Collective Wisdom wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to visit cacollectivewisdom.com or email us at collectivewisdompodcast@gmail.com to join the conversation. Thank you for listening.